cosmos, biological life, consciousness, intelligence. How did it all begin? Is it just an inscrutable brute fact that the universe had to be this way? Or is the universe and life within it the creation of the God of the Christian Scriptures, the risen Lord Jesus Christ? Have modern science and our technologically sophisticated age finally done away with the ancient theological traditions? Or will the secularists reach the final explanatory mountaintop only to find a band of theologians who have been sitting there for centuries? These questions have been debated since the dawn of creation. Moses and the ancient Egyptians, to Plato and Aristotle, Jesus and the Pharisees and Sadducees, to atheists and Christians here in the 21st century. On this episode of the Atheist and Christian Book Club, we continue this long-standing tradition, exploring the philosophical and theological nature of these questions. Our guests this month are atheist philosopher Dr. Graham Oppy and Christian philosopher Dr. Timothy McGrew. Our featured book is their 2016 co-authored collection of essays, Four Views on Christianity and Philosophy, published by Zondervan. Here is the host and co-founder of the Atheist and Christian Book Club, James Walker.
Welcome to the Atheist and Christian Book Club. We are a monthly gathering of believers and skeptics respectfully discussing important books from both perspectives. We usually alternate Christian book one month and atheist book the next. Last month and this month, we're actually having both the atheist and a Christian author in at the same time to discuss a book that they work together on. My name is James Walker. I'm president of an evangelical apologetics ministry called Watchman Fellowship. We focus mostly on interfaith evangelism, research in the area of new religious movements, cults, the occult, controversial doctrines, practices, and spiritual leaders. And I'm the co-founder about 4 years ago of the book club, along with my friend Bill Cluck, who's a former Christian, now atheist. Bill is with us this evening as well. We've got a great meeting prepared for you guys today that we're going to get into in just a second. I did want to take just a few minutes to talk about a little bit of housekeeping of some things we've got coming up. First of all, on our website, atheistchristianbookclub.com, we have now uploaded last month's video of our book club last month. Our guest authors were Paul Copan and Michael Roos. Paul Copan, Christian philosopher from Palm Beach Atlantic University. Michael Roos, professor, I think maybe professor emeritus now of philosophy at FSU, Florida State University in Tallahassee. They came on to talk about their book, which is a Zondervan kind of point-counterpoint book, Three Views on Christianity and Science. And we had I think a really great meeting. If you weren't participating, didn't get a chance to, go to the website atheistchristianbookclub.com, and you'll get to watch it there along with probably a year and a half's worth of other book clubs. So I wanted to let you know that that's available, and then talk about what we've got coming up next month. We're going to be finally looking at a Richard Dawkins book. So we're going to talk about Outgrowing God, the Richard Dawkins book, Outgrowing God. I think it was 2019 that he came out with that book. Now, we usually try to get the author. Sometimes that's impossible. We talked about Tony Flu's book, There Is a God, and of course he passed away, as well as Christopher Hitchens. We did God Is Not Great, and of course that's going to be impossible to get the author. I would say it's going to be almost impossible to get Richard Dawkins. I would say that we don't have a prayer, but maybe that would not be appropriate in the Atheist and Christian Book Club to say that. So I'm not going to say that, but I will say that we are trying.
We allow you to pray.
We will. Okay, thank you. Okay, Bill,
one,
that's a good one to pray about. So, but I would like to, I'm not going to rule that out, and we're going to try our best to see if we can get him in for that. But it's an introduction to atheism, so for most of our atheist members, this might be kind of introductory. It may be not in the depth that they're looking at, but hey, he's an important author and probably kind of the face of either at least the new atheist. So we need to really do his book if we're gonna do the club right. But this month, I'm so excited, and we've been looking forward for this for a long time. We are going to be looking at another Zondervan point counterpoint book. We're going to be looking at 4 views on Christianity and philosophy. And our 2 guest authors, I'm real excited about our guest authors. Tim McGrew, good friend. He's a professor of philosophy at Western Michigan University in Kalamazoo. He's been one of our most popular guests in the 4-year history of our book club. He's a contributor to tonight's book, 4 Views on Christianity and Philosophy, which Paul Gould, I think, was our friend Paul Gould, one of the editors of that work as well. And Tim's going to be representing the convergent model that philosophy confirms Christianity. And welcome to the book club, Tim. And then our other guest, all the way from Australia, is atheist philosopher Graham Oppy from Australia, whose main area of research is philosophy of religion. He currently holds the post of Professor of Philosophy and Associate Dean of Research at Monash University, serves as CEO at the AAP. Now, Graham's going to be arguing, he did in the book, and tonight he's going to be talking about the conflict model that Christianity conflicts with philosophy. Now, Ken Daniels, who's one of our longtime atheist members, also an author himself, is a former Christian, actually former missionary with Wycliffe. And he hated that he was going to miss tonight because he's a real fan of Dr. Oppy. And he sent me a little video. I had not seen this before. I just looked at it today. And it's a Christian philosopher and apologist, William Lane Craig, talking about Graham Oppy. And he identifies, Bill Craig identifies Graham Oppy as probably the leading atheist philosopher of our day. And in fact, I think the words he used was, he's scary smart. So I think we're in for a great book club, and I want to welcome both of you guys. First of all, let me say welcome to Graham. Anything you'd like to say to us?
Thanks for inviting me.
Well, thanks so much for being a part of this. And then Tim, would you like to start off with a word?
It's good to be here, at least virtually. Can't wait to get back down there to Texas. By the way, I am going to be down in November when my wife is speaking at the ETS meeting. So if y'all have a slot in November that overlaps with the week of that meeting, let me know. That might not be the right time of month, but if so, I'd love to drop in.
Oh, we will make it the right time of month. We can we can always make that happen. So, and Graham, the same's open for you if you ever find yourself in the United States of Texas. Well, let me start off. Bill, our co-founder, has some questions. We've been talking back and forth the last couple of days about the meeting, and we are going to open up the questions to our whole book club. And what do we have, about 60 or so in the meeting right now? I'm sure more will join us. So what we're going to do is I'm going to ask a question, maybe ask Bill if he'll ask a question or two. But if you're part of the book club, you have a question for either of our authors, or a comment would be fine as well. The easiest thing to do, if you'll put that in the chat, the group chat for everybody, and then Daniel Ray, one of our staff, is going to be looking at that and kind of sorting out and inviting you up to ask your question kind of on camera, so to speak. I'm going to do this. I'm going to go ahead and close off the share screen here, if I can figure out how to do that. We'll go back into that mode. It's right there. And let me see what I have that here. Yeah, I had a question for Graham to kind of kick things off a little bit. Concerning your definition of worldviews, you said, quote, "There is nothing that atheistic worldviews have in common apart from their rejection of theism." So looking for that common ground, and basically it's just the rejection of theism. Do you think that atheism has the basic characteristics of a worldview in and of itself, or is it just the lack of a belief, or maybe in this case, the lack of a worldview that it just usually happens to find affinity with some form of philosophical naturalism? How would you help us define those kind of things?
So I think of worldviews as kind of comprehensive pictures, and atheism by itself isn't a comprehensive picture. I mean, merely thinking that there are no gods just doesn't give you a full account of everything. So atheistic worldviews are very diverse. And maybe it's an exaggeration to say that there's nothing else that atheists agree on apart from there not being any gods, because there's lots of common sense things that they probably more or less all agree on. But when it comes to kind of big ticket religious, philosophical items, they can disagree about pretty much everything else.
So is there a particular subset of worldviews that most atheists will naturally gravitate to, or could you be literally all over the map?
I think strands of Buddhism, for example, that are atheistic, and there are strands of other kinds of religions, perhaps, that are atheistic as well. So I think that thinking about it globally and historically, it can be all over the map. If you look in contemporary philosophy, contemporary professional philosophy, you'll probably find that most of the people who are atheists, though by no means all of them, are naturalists. And so there'll be people who think that, at least as far as causal reality goes, the natural world is what there is.
So the worldview is going to be usually some form of naturalism.
Amongst professional philosophers, I don't want to kind of spread it out further, to extend it further than that, because there'll be a lot of
thanks for that. That helps clarify, I think, a lot. So my friend Bill Cluck, co-founder of the Atheist Christian Book Club, he, I know, has some questions we've already talked about privately amongst ourselves, but Bill, you want to ask a question of our authors?
Yeah, first of all, I'm saying hello to Tim McGrew. We love him here in Dallas. I've got to agree with you there. It's just terrific having him back, James, even on video. Can't wait for you to come back, Tim. One, I love the book, especially Graham and Tim's section. I wasn't too hot on the other two, especially the Calvinistic view, which basically says, God is sovereign. He knows everything. The Bible is true, infallible word of God. Just shut up and let us handle it from here. Faith is magisterial over reason. So the problem with that is that Graham made some good arguments. One I particularly liked is that naturalism is simplistic. It doesn't need trinities. It doesn't need angels. It doesn't need these extra things to make its case. So just when I felt really good about my atheism, Tim goes and counters with some superb arguments, which, thanks, Tim, for undermining my faith there a little bit. So anyway, also in the book on page 137, you have the 7 premises of the problem of evil, and Tim addresses number 4 and does some really good apologetic work. So if you're just one of these hardcore Calvinists that, we're just going to look at the Bible, we hate natural philosophy, then guess what? You're not going to get through to people like us, okay? So, but I have 2 questions. This one's both to Tim McGrew. The first question is that in the last 100 years, ever since Schweitzer's book, In Search of the Historical Jesus, the common view in scholarship is that Jesus is best viewed as an apocalyptic prophet, thought the world was going to end, predicted it in scripture, and basically had a bad week in Jerusalem and it didn't work out. If you read Dale Allison's book, Jesus, Apocalyptic Prophet of the New Millenarian, he lays out a beautiful case that shows that there are very good reasons to believe that Jesus is best viewed apocalyptically. His mentor was John the Baptist, who was an eschatological prophet. His followers believed that the coming was any day now. So you have this strong evidence, and Bart Ehrman's book, Jesus Christ, Prophet of the 2000-year millennium, or whatever, 1000-year millennium. So this is the consensus of scholarship. So my question to Tim is, shouldn't we listen to the small voice, still voice of scholarship and go with this view?
Okay, lots to talk about here. I think that you're generally right about the trend in historical Jesus work since Schweitzer, though there have been riffs and variants on it since the beginning of like Third Quest historical Jesus studies. And Allison certainly does make his case. Did Jesus preach apocalyptically? Absolutely. Did he preach, as opposed to did some of his disciples assume that this is what he meant, that he was coming again immediately? I think that's a lot less clear. And I think actually the funny thing about that is that Christians have been engaging with this since before Schweitzer. If you look at some of George Park Fisher's work from a little bit more than a century ago, you'll find Fisher saying in response to a rising tide of this kind of thing, Schweitzer's not even the only one to have done it at that time. Look, there are other strands in Jesus' teaching as reported in the New Testament as well. You've got the whole parable of the mustard tree, for example, which takes a long time to grow up, and it grows up gradually. You've got the parable of the wheat and the tares, and it's quite a long time. At first, they look very similar. It's going to take a while for them to ripen. And so you've got strands in his parables that I think pull in a different direction. So I would say, yeah, there's apocalyptic teaching. That much is absolutely uncontroversial. I don't know how you could read the Gospels and not get that. But I don't think, which is what Allison is sort of, at least in one mood, tempted to say. Allison's, as he's told us recently, 4 different people living inside the same body, and he's, as he said in an interview recently, but at least in some moods, and as Bart Ehrman definitely thinks, I would not say that Jesus was a failed apocalyptic prophet, because I think that there's some misreading there of what's going on. I think that misreading is understandable, and I think that some of Jesus' immediate followers jumped to that conclusion. So I'm not trying to say that there was no reason for it, but yeah, sometimes we just have to say, yeah, I see what the consensus of the scholarship is currently, but that consensus is not something we have to allow to be a stand-in for an actual consideration of the arguments. So we've got to look at the arguments straight up. And when we do, I am persuaded that a fairly large amount of what goes on in New Testament studies at the present time is dysfunctional, methodologically dysfunctional. And so I'm, no surprise, Bill, I'm not gonna just, hitch my wagon to that particular train. But you had a second.
Certainly don't agree with Borg and Crossan that he was a cynic and sage.
No. That's even further out. And no, I absolutely would not. I suppose I should just gently let all of these gentlemen cross-critique one another and sit nearby eating popcorn.
Okay, the second question, and here's the thing: your chapter, whatever, was very lucid, very cogent, very well thought out. And I was really with you on consciousness, the beginning of the universe. You just made some very concise, well thought out arguments. Then when it comes to Christianity, you go right off the rails. You say that Jesus was this magnificent person. He would, in arguments, he would say something and stun his critics. Well, that's because what you're reading is historical fiction. People don't, especially when you're up against rabbis and you're some rogue priest, you don't make statements and they just go, well, man, Jesus, that sounds good. We really don't have anything to say. Or when he first met his disciples and said, go follow me, people don't just stop their work. You're reading fiction. You're not reading history. Plus, you said Bart Ehrman laid out 50 contradictions, and there's like 5 substantive ones. Well, let me tell you, these substantive ones are very problematic. You have the women coming in Mark to the tomb. The tomb's already opened. In Matthew, it's opened before them. I mean, this isn't tangential. This is a key element to the story. You have the amount of witnesses, are different in the gospel accounts. you have just one contradiction over the other. Plus, in Acts, you say that this is historically reliable. Acts has Judas hanging himself or falling off a cliff, and in Matthew, he hangs himself. So one's got to be wrong. These are Christian propaganda. They're not historically reliable.
As Dr. Laura Schlesinger used to say, what is your question for me?
Yeah, okay. Tell me if you're, well, I know Swinburne, born or whatever in London, has said there's a 99% chance the resurrection is true, correct?
He gives that as an illustrative number in a calculation where he admits that he's filling in some what he thinks are plausible but not airtight numbers, and it's designed to try to show how the Bayesian calculation works.
But did you not say it was above 99%?
No. Are you thinking of the Blackwell article?
Okay, I don't know, but let me just lay out my case and ask my question. So in Resurrecting Jesus, Dale Allison's new book, he gives a very balanced view in that he admits there's problems. And just like in his book, Jesus, Apocalyptic Prophet, he says Jesus was wrong. And this is what's odd, is he's a Christian, but he realizes the problem after problem with the Gospels and with Jesus. So my question to you is, and there's one scholar that after reading his book said that he's gone from 15% belief that Jesus' resurrection is possible to only 10%. And I would go with that too, 10%. But what I would ask you is, what percentage would you give that Jesus rose from the dead in his, the typical traditional orthodoxy that he's gotten?
Okay, so do you want me first to do a quick rundown on the various contradictions, claims? Okay, so I think most of what you said there is false. If you'll read the gospel accounts, you'll find that there's a question of the grammar of the verb in Matthew as to whether it's saying that the angel rolled away the stone or had rolled away the stone. You can take it either way. So as far as whether the stone was already rolled away when the women arrived, this is not, I think, a contradiction. None of the Gospels claims to have a comprehensive list of the women at the tomb. Luke even says, after enumerating some names, and others with them. So you can't take omission to be denial. And so I just think that won't wash. Most of what Barth has to say about the resurrection narratives will not stand up to a moderately charitable reading of the actual primary sources. I encourage you to just go back, list what he claims one at a time, and just go back and read them and say, really, is this actually a contradiction? Because a lot of what Barth claims to be a contradiction is not. The Judas one, I believe I actually addressed the last time that I was physically there with you guys in Arlington. So that one's up on YouTube. Have a look at that. I don't claim to have a definitive answer to that, but I do think that there's a plausible answer to that. So you can check out what I had to say at that time. Dale Allison. Dale Allison writes like an angel. He's a wonderful stylist. He is a bibliographic monster. He has read a tremendous amount of material. Epistemically, he's a babe in the woods. He says a lot of things epistemologically that I think are just flatly unsupportable. He actually says in his most recent book on the resurrection, that kind of reasoning that we use where we act like detectives and we try to take the various clues and put them together and find the best explanation of them. We absolutely must not do that with regard to the resurrection of Jesus. Now, if I were Dale Allison and I wanted to stay away from the claim that Jesus physically rose from the dead, I'd try to stay away from that kind of reasoning too, because I don't think it's his friend. If you want to maintain that position, I think you should try to avoid whatever else you're doing. Keep doing the kind of reasoning that we do in history, that we do in forensic detection, that we do in science. So that sort of inference to the best explanation is definitely something that he does not do, and specifically eschews doing. He, in my view, rather arbitrarily picks and chooses which bits of the text he likes and which bits he doesn't like. And if you allow anyone to do that with any historical document, then you can put together something that is going to support whatever view you want to take. You give me any set of historical documents and you let me say, I like this bit, I don't like that bit, I'm just going to disregard this whole chapter of the other thing, and then I will come up with what looks like great support out of the little snippets that I have left. That is not good historical methodology, and I would go into more length in my discussion of Allison if this were something focused on that, but I dread taking time away from Graham because I know he's raring to go, and he's got a quite different sort of argument, a more in principle kind of argument that touches on these things a little bit, but is more generally designed to show that naturalism is simpler, ergo more plausible ab initio, and then naturalism just sort of wins the evidential tug-of-war with every single piece of the data at hand. And so I want Graham to have a chance to articulate that. But that's my brief version, Bill. And if I get down there in November and we're able to get together, I will have a meal with you, and I will give you all the time you want, and we can bring our copies of Allison with us. And if Terry wants to come, I'll play her a game of chess while we're at it. And we will go ahead and we'll hammer it out.
Great. And I think your wife read the book and she gave some comments that he was Neo-Bartian and so forth, which were, a nice little comment. Anyway, well, what's your percentage?
For the resurrection, I don't have a number that I want to pin on it, but I'll say this. I'm losing no sleep over the question of whether I'm wrong. Now, in the 18th century, some mathematicians actually got together to try to compute what's the probability that we could peg as a moral certainty. Basically, a healthy man age 40 goes to bed at night. It's peacetime. He's in his own house. He loses no sleep over the thought that he might not wake up tomorrow. Okay, let's do tables of actuarial data and see what's that probability. And they pegged it at 99.99%. That was a moral certainty. I don't really know that I'd set much stock in that calculation, but if you wanted to put it there, I'm somewhere up there where I'm losing no sleep over it. Although I got to tell you, Bill, if you're at 10%, then you might be losing a little bit of sleep, wondering if maybe it happened after all.
Well, absolutely, the stakes are high, but I want to be fair and balanced like Dale Allison. And hopefully we can read his book, Resurrecting Jesus, because he does have a very honest, balanced approach and looks at the problems which the Calvinists and Reformed people just do not want to address. So anyway, let me let Graham talk.
Well, let me just make two quick comments. Number one, I think you guys, if you did choose that as a book that you're going to read, you would have a good chance of getting Dale on. He's fairly accessible. And so I think you might want to look into that. And second, just to pick up, Bill, on what you said, I enjoyed my interactions with Graham in our Zondervan book most of all the interactions. The other two authors had a lot of their own fish to fry, and that made it sometimes difficult to interact. But with Graham, despite our wide differences, I felt like we always both knew what was at stake. And so I really appreciated that, and that gave us an opportunity to engage more directly with each other than I felt was possible with some of the others.
Well, I was sympathizing with you, Tim, going, Tim, come on, show him,
I have a kind of a follow-up. You guys both touched on it just to make sure I understood correctly, and then maybe if you could kind of, it was dealt with really in the rejoinder as well. Bill touched right on this idea of this, the naturalism being a much on the surface simpler explanation. If you could pack, great explanatory content, breadth, depth into just naturalism, you don't have to add the complexity of adding a supernatural worldview or supernatural argument on top of that. But if I understood correctly, what you were arguing, Tim, was that really it's you're not agnostic on this other question, that really you're still having two components, in this case naturalism and non-theism. First of all, did I understand you correctly, that you see it as no more simple than the Christian worldview?
So I wouldn't put it quite that way. Naturalism, as I understand Graham's version of it, entails atheism. And so it's not, those wouldn't be the two components. The components would be, there's a natural world with the entities and the causal powers that they have and the causal laws governing that world. And in addition, the theist says, there is a realm of non-physical but causally efficacious reality. So we're not just talking non-physical in the sense of abstract numbers, for example, like some Platonists might say, but we're talking about entities with causal powers in addition to those listed in the natural world, the description of the natural world. The naturalist position is that there is a natural world, so far right online with the typical theist today, and there's not a realm of causally efficacious, non-natural entities, beings, etc. And that second claim is a claim, and it needs to be made out. If we were just comparing there is a natural world to there is a natural world plus, that would be one thing, but the naturalist is making a limitative claim. There is a natural world, and causally speaking, that's all. That's as far as it goes. That also is a claim, and it's a claim that requires support. If you were merely listing the entities that we have and judging simplicity that way, the naturalist is going to have a shorter list, right? No God, no angels and demons. So the naturalist's list of those things is going to be shorter, but a shorter list like that does not always help explanatorily. So that's, when you also have to deny some things, and I can give examples of this, then that's where I think it becomes problematic. And so it's not simple in the sense that, well, you've got 5 entities and we've got 3, so we win. It's not that simple at all. And I think Graham would also agree, actually, that it's not that simple, but we might disagree a little bit on the technical margins of that. But let me let him talk now. It's his position.
Yeah, I was going to take it over to Graham. I know that you dealt with this in the rejoinder, but I think it would be helpful just for our group tonight if you could kind of talk a little bit about what you did in the rejoinder on that issue.
Okay, so I'm thinking that the way that we evaluate the views is we see which one manages the trade-off between minimizing commitments and maximizing explanation the best. And so one thing that we can ask is whether one view is simpler than another. And the way that I'm going to reckon that crudely, and it's more complicated than this, will just be by counting the entities. And if that's how you go, then naturalism will be simpler. But the question will be, how does it do on explanation? It's got less to work with. So you might think it's probably going to do less well at the explanation. And so there's another part to the inquiry. The fact that a view is simpler on its own is not a virtue. Think about being a nihilist, saying there's nothing at all. Your view can't get simpler, but that's a terrible view. It can't explain any of the data.
I do think that helps, and kind of it was touched on, but I think this helps us flesh out a little bit more of the discussion from the book. I think Raymond Stewart, Ray might have a question.
For Graham, why should we care about minimizing the number of entities? And I think this might be what Tim is thinking, is that what we really care about in a theory is having the fewest number of propositions we're committed to, which to me, that seems like the way to count simplicity. But why should I care whether a theory commits me to 5 entities or 6 entities? I'm not sure why we should care about that in the first place.
Okay, so I said it was a proxy. I can tell you a longer story about what I mean by simplicity. And the first thing that I'll think about is the axiomatizations of the theories. And one thing that's important for simplicity is, how simple the axiomatization is. So that will speak directly to the comment that you just made. On the question about entities, suppose you've got 2 theories that just turn out to be equal. So they explain everything equally well, and they would be equal on simplicity, except that one of them has this extra entity that it postulates. The question is, what reason is there to postulate that entity? Surely you would prefer the theory, given what I just said, that does without it, right? That's the sort of straightforward intuition. That's why the numbers matter. You don't actually have any reason in the data, the evidence that you've got for postulating that thing, because postulating it doesn't buy you any explanatory advantage. So the sensible thing to do will be not to believe in it. That's the account.
I can give a quick illustration of what I take Graham to be saying. Many years ago, I was awakened by a clattering noise in my house in the middle of the night, so I got up to see what was going on, wondering if somebody was trying to break in a window. I got out to the kitchen and found our cat on the kitchen table with a plastic tumbler tipped over on its side and a spreading pool of water on the tabletop. I immediately understood that my cat had engaged in her favorite game of finding partially full water cups and tipping them over. That was the noise that I had heard, and whatever my nerves might be saying, I could go to bed. It would have been superfluous at that point for me to suppose that in addition to the cat, there was also a burglar trying to break into the house. Because at that point, the evidence has been explained away adequately by the cat's agency. And so there's no need then, and really no point to postulating yet another entity simultaneously trying to act in some way. The evidence has already been taken care of. I take it that that's what Graham is talking about.
Yeah, Ray, did you have a follow-up?
Yeah, so I get those kind of examples, but those aren't analogous to the case we're talking about. Because what we really have in a case like that is we have one theory, and then we have an additional thing we're wondering about, like, hey, is there a burglar breaking in? But it's not as though we have two theories. In a case like Christianity versus naturalism, or just anything else versus anything else in philosophy, it's not as though we have one theory and then one theory that explains all the stuff in the same way, and then also posits just one other thing. What we have are two competing theories. So it might be something more like this, right? Where we find a man who's been shot with two guns, right? And we could say, well, maybe a guy came in, guns akimbo, and shot him with two guns, or maybe there were two different shooters. Where there's one posits more things, they each explain it equally well. I mean, you might look at the way the bullets go in and say, I don't know, it's inconclusive. Could have been one gun in each hand, could have been two different shooters. In that case, even though one posits an extra thing, that extra thing is not explanatorily inert. We have two different theories explaining the data in different ways, and I'm unmoved by the fact that one of them has extra stuff in that case. Positing explanatorily inert entities, yes, I can grant that. That's something we shouldn't do, but it's not because they're extra stuff. It's because, like, we have no reason in the first place to posit them. They seem to have some low prior probability. Seems to me to be the issue, not just how many of them there are.
Tim, does Christianity bring more explanatory content into the data set?
Well, that's precisely the point where Graham and I think most vigorously disagree. Graham thinks that all of the explanatory work that you could reasonably ask for is already done by the bit that a contemporary, well-educated, scientifically minded Christian has in common with a parallel atheist, which is that, yes, there's a natural world, there are such and such entities, they are governed by these laws, we know something about how that works. Graham thinks that that will do at least as well explanatorily with regard to all of the data. And I obviously don't think that at all, quite the contrary. But if I thought Graham were right, then I would be a lot more attracted to what he calls the best argument against God, that kind of simplicity argument. But it all depends on whether the explanation can actually be carried out with regard to all the different classes of facts. And I don't think that in my saying that, I'm saying something Graham disagrees with. It's then the substantive question, yes, but can it, where I think we're really at loggerheads.
Graham?
Right, so I agree absolutely about that.
Any other comments on that, Graham, or clarifications?
Sure. So I should say something about the best argument. So I have a book called The Best Argument Against God. And the title of the book is, in a way, is kind of misleading, because I don't, as if you read to the end of the book, you know that I don't endorse the argument. I don't think that it's a compelling or convincing argument. I do think that it sets out the position that I actually accept. So I think that naturalism is a better theory than theism for the reason that's just been described, because it's simpler, but it does at least as well in doing all the explaining. But I don't expect to persuade other people. I don't expect to persuade Tim that that's so. But we can still argue about the cases, because I could easily be wrong about some of the cases, and it would still be true that my position is better, but the argument then wouldn't work. right? At all. It would just be coming down to a judgment about, okay, when you kind of consider the trade-offs between what you get to explain here and what you don't explain there and what you postulate, I still think overall naturalism comes out better. That's a kind of perfectly acceptable position as well.
Right. Let me just illustrate what Graham said by saying that in one regard, I'm maybe even a little bit more generous on my side than he is on his. I actually think that there are pieces of data that point against the existence of God. And I would take as examples, some natural and some moral evils as pieces of evidence that I do think have some weight against the existence of God, although I think it's possible to overestimate that weight. But I am not one of these people who has to say every piece of evidence favors my view over the atheist naturalist view. That it is a vector sum, and some of the vectors point one way, some point the other way. I just happen to think that the very significant preponderance of them point in the direction not only of theism but of Christianity, and so that there's an example of what Graham was saying. If he became persuaded that he was wrong about some of these things, he might still retain his position, but then it is a matter of assessing those trade-offs.
Right, and maybe it's worth mentioning one other important difference between us, which is that I think that you're more sympathetic to the idea that you could do a Bayesian calculation with actual numbers, whereas I'm kind of skeptical about that. And so I think that if you're looking to produce an argument, it would be much easier in the Bayesian framework, because assuming that you could get agreement on the numbers, you could churn out the answer and it doesn't matter how the cases fall. Whereas I think that you're not going to get anything that looks like an argument, except in a very special case where you've got kind of dominance, right? So that
right, and so that's why you take that dominance view, weak dominance, with regard to each piece of evidence, and just leave it at the inequalities rather than attempting any kind of quantitative analysis. Right, I did notice that. Exactly.
Hey, we've got a question coming in from one of our members on the way to the airport, but he's listening in, and this is for Graham, actually. I'm going to ask Daniel, would you read that question?
Absolutely.
From Ken?
Yes. So Ken is a longtime club member, and so he couldn't join us tonight. He says, can you explain, again, this is for you, Graham, can you explain how atheism accounts for the existence of everything better than theism? Considering arguments such as the argument from contingency. Oh, wait, that's not Ken's. That's another one. Excuse me. That's another one that's coming down the pike. So keep that one in the back of your mind. Sorry. He says, could you, Graham, this is Ken, offer a simple synopsis of what you think might have precipitated the onset of time and causation, assuming time and causation haven't always existed? Ken says, like you, I am not a theist, but I have trouble wrapping my mind around this question, just as I would have questions about what it would mean for God to make a decision to act in the absence of time. And that is from Ken. And if you'd like me to repeat that, I will.
I don't think you need to repeat it. And maybe what I say will answer the other question as well at the same time. I'm not sure.
Okay. All right.
So the way, I mean, it goes back to what I think about necessity and possibility. So philosophers have different theories about what they call modality, and they often frame it in terms of possible worlds. Whether or not they actually believe in there actually being possible worlds, it's a kind of nice picture, a nice way of thinking about it. So I think, sort of on independent grounds, that the best theory of modality is going to be one which says that every possible world shares some initial history with the actual world and branches off it at some point, because chances play out differently. So there's indeterministic causation, and that's what the possibilities are. You need the possibilities if you've got indeterministic causation. Now, suppose there's a beginning to the actual world. That beginning is going to be shared by all the possible worlds, so it'll be necessary. Right? So if we explain, if we ask ourselves, so why did the actual world start out the way it did? The answer is because it had to. Right? And this theory is one that is open to theists and naturalists to adopt. Theists can think there's an necessary origin, it's God. And then God makes a choice. Maybe there's some indeterminism there if you think that there are different ways that the world could come out. But anyway, every world goes back to a common origin, and the naturalists can think the same thing. It's just that the initial state is whatever the initial state of natural reality turns out to be. And at the moment, we'd be guessing. Physics doesn't tell us, not in any way that's secured agreement, what the initial state's like. What that means is that you can give the same answer to these questions about the nature, the sort of modal status of the origins, whether you're a theist or a naturalist. And so, according to me, there's just a tie in the ability of the two theories to explain origins.
Okay, thank you. Tim, before we go to another question, would you have anything to add or take away from that?
Yeah, Graham is right that there are a number of different ways of parsing modal language. The more standard Leibnizian one would allow for a much wider range of possible worlds than the one that Graham is describing. If you adopt Graham's, then you get to say, and I take it that this is a point that Graham had in mind, that the first state of causal reality is in common to all possible worlds. That, however, is something that you get to say only on certain conceptions of modality and not on others. So if you take the broader Kripkean kind of approach in the Lewisian style possible worlds, then possible worlds are merely maximal, deconsistent, omega complete sets. And so those don't have to share anything. If you take the Aristotelian view, possibility and necessity are tied to quantification over time. So there are all kinds of different ways that you can do it. I'm happy in some contexts to talk in the Leibnizian way, in some context to talk in the Aristotelian way. I would just say that it's a little too convenient, but I understand why Graham does it, right? He's got a set of views. His view of modality hangs together with them. That reduces cognitive dissonance. If I were a naturalist, I might find that beneficial, but I'm not. And so I'm not inclined to take that view, but I do understand the claim that he's making and the way that it fits together into his overall view.
So maybe I should add one further thing, that I am talking about metaphysical modality here, and there is another kind of modality which you might think of as epistemic or doxastic or something like that, about what can reasonably be believed. And the Kripkean conception about, and various others about maximally consistent sets of sentences is that kind of modality. It's just got nothing to do with metaphysics.
Okay,
so it's not that I just reject it outright. I just think it's not metaphysical.
Okay, thank you guys. James, we have a question from Clint. Clint, if you can hear us, you can unmute and ask the question that I read halfway through, if you are still around. So Clint.
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, you didn't give a spoiler alert on my question, so Graham may already be kind of primed to answer.
Yeah. Sorry about that.
No, it's all right. I apologize about my video too. It was being wonky, so I'm not able to put my video live. But my question was for Graham. And so, first of all, thank you for being here to explain your point of view, and Tim too, of course. So my question for Graham would be, could you explain, and maybe I missed how your explanation came out when you were talking about modality, but can you explain how atheism accounts for the existence of everything better than theism, especially considering that there are theistic arguments, such as the argument from contingency and Aquinas' argument from motion, which, if true, show that atheism can't account for the existence of things like the contingent universe and things like that. So considering that those kinds of arguments are on the table, how then can atheism account for these things better than theism? And the one thing that I did pick out from your explanation was that atheists also see that the beginning was necessary, but saying that the beginning is a necessary event doesn't really answer the question, because the atheist still has to account for how that universe could come about necessarily if God is off the table. So I was hoping you might be able to explain a little bit more about your views on that.
So, there's a couple of things there. One thing will be, supposing that you claim that something's necessary, are you done at that point as far as what you can explain goes? I think so. Otherwise, there's a burden on the theist to explain how it is that God's necessary, right? The idea that you've got a stopping point, at least absent, there are kind of metaphysical views where you can try to explain the necessity in terms of something else, but I'm not inclined to go that way. So I don't think that there's a problem there. On the question about the contingency argument, the argument from motion and things like that, I say that if they want, naturalists can just suppose that those arguments are sound when they take you to the conclusion that there's a first cause or that there's a necessary origin or something like that. Where they disagree is in the much more controversial later step that in those kinds of arguments that's supposed to get you from that thing's existence to its being the God of Christianity or the God of theism.
Do you have a follow-up, Clint? Do you want to follow up on anything?
No, I just was just looking for an explanation. I appreciate Graham's response to my question, so thank you.
Super. We got a relative neighbor of yours, Graham, Luke Barnes. I'm sure you know Luke. Do you guys know each other? I'm sure you do.
No, never.
No.
Not all Australians know each other, man. Come on. Wow.
Tiny place.
It's such a small little place, guys. I thought
Literally
you would,
2,000 kilometers away from where I am right now.
And they're all named Bruce, right?
Yeah, only the philosophers are.
No, that's okay. Yeah, fire away, sir. Have at it.
So I think this follows on nicely. So in the book that we're here to supposedly discuss, you consider the example of global causal structure, Graham. And the way the argument goes is, why is there a network of causal relations rather than a complete absence? There are two ways to explain this. Either it's impossible for there to be a complete absence, or there is ultimately no reason why there is a causal network. And then you argue that both answers are available on both naturalism and theism, so the whole thing just washes out. I just need a few details filled in. It's quick in the book because you point us elsewhere as well. But A, why are those the only two options? Because the sort of answer that you might expect from theism would be in terms of God having a reason to create a world with a causal structure. The sort of argument you get from Swinburne about, moral agents would need to interact with each other and have morally blah, blah, blah. If that's true, then that's neither of those two cases, but that seems to be what theism is trying to do. And then secondly, the fact that two answers are available, it surely isn't sufficient for it to wash out. I noticed if you look behind Tim, there's that Edwin James's book Probability Theory on the shelf up there. It's nice to have the other Bible available to us at hand. There's more that you need to other side. There it is. Surely we need more than just them being available for that to be. Yeah. Everyone take note. Surely we need more. I'll end it there. Thanks.
Yeah. Okay. So both points that you make are correct. And so in the kind of literature that I pointed you to, my earlier writings, there's a much longer and more elaborate argument. On the one hand, there's a bunch of possibilities. There could be infinite regress. There could be a purely contingent initial state. There could be a kind of absolutely necessary initial state, or there could be a state that's got some necessary elements in it, but it's not purely contingent. And if you think about the theistic option that goes to reasons, that might be one where you've got a state that's got a mix of necessity. God has to exist, but the reasons that God's got are contingent, because on the standard story, there are different possible worlds where God creates differently. Presumably that's because the reasons are different, and that's kind of where the explanation ends. So you get this kind of brute contingency in the story. That would be the kind of story, for example, that William Lane Craig would urge against me when we're in discussion about these matters, right? So there's a bunch of different things, a bunch of different views. And then the question is, what's the explanation going to look like in each of these cases? And is there some advantage, right? Something that's kind of getting explained better on one version than the other, given the limited range of things that we're trying to explain, why there's a causal network, why there's something rather than nothing, how it comes about that there's contingency, and so on. And I think that you can argue in each case that the naturalist story, given the resources that it's got, is at least as good as the theistic story. But that's a longer story, right? That's where the bulk of the work is.
So one of the things I wonder, especially as a scientist, is when are you sort of allowed to say the word necessary? When as a philosopher are you allowed to play that card? Because what it looks like is that you're just grabbing one of the terms in the probability calculus and announcing that it's equal to 1, and therefore I win, or at least I'm doing better than you thought I might have. And maybe the theist is doing that as well. But that's something that for me is not clear, especially when I've heard you talk about sort of fine tuning and as another case of, well, it's necessary that the initial conditions are like this, is you sort of avoid a very low probability by getting your pen and scratching it out and equals 1 above the page and off we go.
So I think that what matters is comparing like with like. So there's a bunch of views here, and my official story is that I'm kind of undecided between all of these options. If you hold my toes to the fire, maybe I'm going to go for the necessary option, but I don't have any great confidence that that's right. So you might be right that they're kind of amongst these options. The worst one is the necessary one, and we should give very little credence to it. That would be fine by me if I was convinced that that's the case. Does that help to explain my attitude?
Sorry, I assumed the next thing you were going to say was it's just the case that however bad that is, theism is just as bad. Is that the way that argument ends?
Well, no, with respect to each of the options, right, the naturalistic story is no worse than the theistic story.
Yes, okay,
right,
yeah.
So there is a story. So, I mean, Leibniz has a story where there's just one possible world and everything's necessary, right? That's one of the views that's on the table. And you can tell a similar naturalistic story if you want to, right? And so on for all of what seem like the options here. You can tell a theistic story, then you can tell a corresponding naturalistic story. And the argument that I ran, so the first time that I ran this argument was in a book edited by Neil Manson about a decade ago now. And there I was quite careful to say that I'm just agnostic between the various options. That's not how the argument was supposed to work. I wasn't arguing for one of the options. I've since found it convenient to pick on the story I like the most and to sort of speak as if I'm defending that particular theory, but really I'm not that confident that my theory is right. So maybe that can do as an answer to your question. I'm not sure if you want to follow up again.
No, sure. I think I'll just go and read your other stuff. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Luke. Tim, do you have a rejoinder or a corollary?
So this is one of the places in our interactions where I was not satisfied with Graham's take on it. I understand, I think now, better than I did at the time that we were writing back and forth in the volume, why he says you can just say, you know, maybe the initial state of the universe is just the first state of causal reality. When you say that whatever begins to exist has a cause, you're talking about things downstream from that. And that holds pretty well downstream, but it doesn't have to hold for that. It still feels to me like a bit of philosophical kleptomania. You found something that you like in the theist position. Physical universe, you know, it's comes into being. Other things you like about the principle that whatever begins to exist is caused to exist by something else, or at least you're willing to consider that, but just not here, not here. I don't really see that as compelling, and I guess this will get onto one of the methodological things that may spin out more as Graham and I go further. But a lot of times it felt to me like Graham would say, all right, you're bringing forward some piece of evidence E, be it the beginning of the universe or something else, and you're saying that theism does better with respect to that. But I have a story I can tell you and a position I can adopt according to which this is more or less inevitable or as likely as it would be on your view. And often that's true, as in this case, where if you take a certain view of modality, then you can do that. But there's also a trade-off there in that I think that involves adopting a rather dodgy view of modality, and so there's got to be some epistemic cost to doing that as well. And so time after time where Graham would say, well, but we could explain that with this or with that, I would say, yeah, these just so stories are kind of being scotch taped together. And I'm not at all confident that they're doing the explanatory job equally well in the sense that you originally postulated, which is doing nothing more, adding nothing else. And it's kind of felt like there were little bits being added on to the naturalism, or little questions that were being sort of brushed aside. So that, now, obviously, Graham doesn't share that perspective, right? I'm just telling you how it looked from my perspective. And so I'm sure he'll have articulate things to say about it. But that was the point at which this form of argument, which in principle, if it worked, would be, I think, a reasonable kind of argument, seemed to me to be coming apart. Let me do something. I'm sure Graham will agree with this, just to illustrate what happens in catastrophic cases. Graham and I would probably, as near as makes no difference, agree about who has existed throughout the history of the world, right? And we're fuzzy around the edges about some of the stuff that happened in eras that we don't have direct access to, but we probably would agree that at best there might have been someone who inspired the story of Robin Hood or King Arthur, really was a Julius Caesar, etc. So, as far as a large-scale human ontology. Now, suppose that I were to say, you know what? I'm going to go lean ontologically. I'm going to have in my ontology all the same people Graham does, except for Abraham Lincoln, right? You disbelieve that I am the president, that James is the president, that Daniel's the president, that Luke is the president. Some of us just go one president further. I'm going to deny that Abraham Lincoln existed. Now, your immediate reaction to that, after your eyebrows climb back down out of your hairline, should be, how exactly are you going to do the explanatory work that's done by postulating the existence of Abraham Lincoln with regard to all sorts of data from the American Civil War period? This is going to have just massive effects everywhere. And I think Graham would immediately concede, merely saying you've got a slightly leaner ontology there is not going to make your view better, because you're going to have an explanatory catastrophe for having yanked out that piece. On a different scale, but similarly, that's what I think is happening with God. Now, that's where Graham disagrees. So he doesn't think the cases are analogous, but I think he would say in the Abraham Lincoln case, yeah, he doesn't want to be caught dead saying you can just thin out your ontology no matter what. It's all the interesting stuff comes then in the question, can you do the explanatory work, really do it as well without that thing?
Right, so that's absolutely correct. And I mean, it's sort of interesting. In the earliest case, when I was running my argument about that was to do with cosmology, to do with the first cause and things like that, I was sort of hesitant to see how far you could push the case. And in the best argument against God, that's the kind of most kind of elaborate version of the argument that I've given, trying to show that you can extend it all the way. And so there's I don't know, 15 or 20 different cases that get discussed in there, and we could disagree about every single one of them, and probably do.
James, thank you, gentlemen. We have a couple of more questions from our guests. Sean Mixon.
Daniel, if you don't mind, just remind everybody how they could get in the queue.
Yeah, okay.
We can try to get to everybody.
Right. If you want to ask Graham or Tim a question live, just send me a direct text message, and that will immediately send you into queue. And I will queue you up and tell you to unmute your mic when your turn is coming. So if you want to send a question, if you just want to verbally express that, send me the question and I'll put you in the queue and we'll line you up. So we have Sean Mixon. Sean, if you can unmute yourself, you are free to ask your question.
All right. Glad to be here. I did have a question for Dr. Oppy. I wanted to know what on your model or picture, what's time? What definition of time or theory of time? Because it would seem, and correct me because I'm asking for an education here. It would seem that if all the different possible worlds split off from one common point because of indeterministic causation, I would wonder like what view of time you would have, because if you have, what is it, the B theory of time, where it's like the extended time is extended in different ways. It seems like that thing would need to be explained because the universe would come into existence within time, or would that be a relational view of time or a non-relational view of time, and how that would work? Because it seems like at least the theist can say something like, well, like Dr. Craig says, there was the universe, God existed timelessly, sons the universe, then his decision to make the universe is simultaneous with the creation of the universe, and then that's a relational view of time, and time is just like the measure of events. But what's your view of time, and how does that work?
Okay, so the first thing I'll say is I'm going to defer to the physicist to give us an account of time. So maybe we can invite Luke to explain it. But so that will be the first thing. The second thing, I think that the story, the theory of modality, will have versions of an A theoretic or B theoretic kind. You can tell the story either way. And I'm inclined to think that, as some people have thought, that you can kind of go backwards and forwards. There's a kind of translation manual that takes you back and forwards between B theory speech and A theory speech, and it doesn't really matter to me that much which way you go. I do think it's an advantage of my view that we don't have to suppose that before the beginning of the universe, there's the kind of period that Bill postulates, where there's a kind of eternity, and at a certain point, God says the universe is going to emerge. Doing without that seems to be a benefit, an advantage of my view.
Dr. Craig, I think Dr. Craig would say that on his view, there is no time, there is no before the universe. That's his view.
Causally, there is, and we can think about the kind of before and after talk. All you need is an order. So the way that we ordinarily think about time, you have before and after, but equally in causation, we can say, well, this event is causally prior to this one, and then this other event was causally prior to that one. I think that there's a kind of difference between the two orders, because I think to have time, you've got to have something like a metric. So you can say things like there's 2 seconds between this event and that event, whereas I'm not sure that out of kind of merely causal order you can get a metric. But anyway, I'll leave it there.
Tim, do you want to follow up with anything?
Oh no, I'm still back here with Augustine saying I know exactly what time is if you don't ask me, but once you ask me, I'm like, say what? So
I like
I'm happy to let Luke play act an operationalist here. He's sort of channeling Percy Bridgman, I think, in the chat.
Yes, exactly. I like the philosophers from Chicago who said, "Does anyone really know what time it is?" Luke, you had a great definition of time. You want to share it with everybody? They may not have seen it in the chat.
In my first special relativity lecture, the lecturer just said, "Time is what you measure with a clock," and then on we went. And that was all we needed. So I actually think that it is a philosophical question. It should be informed by physics, but at that point, it is a philosophical question.
Yes. Thank you, Sean. Thank you, gentlemen, for your answers. Zach, if you're on and ready to go, you can unmute and ask your question.
Yeah, thanks so much. I guess I have a question for both of them. A question about modality. So a number of these debates turn on modal claims. So for example, contingency arguments have as premises modal claims. But there are these general questions we can ask about modality itself. And one view that some philosophers have been sympathetic to is a kind of conventionalism about modality. So on this view, there are certain principles, you might call them the laws of metaphysics, for example. And when you hold those fixed, then certain things must be the case, certain things are possible, and so on. But if you don't hold them fixed, then you might get a different result. But what goes on the list of the laws of metaphysics and what doesn't is purely a matter of convention. It's just about, what we decide to put on the list. So for example, if we hold composition fixed, then it's going to be impossible that you have exactly these parts arranged in such and such ways and you don't get the whole. But maybe we decide not to put composition on the list. It's purely a matter of convention. So my question is, it's really two parts. What do you both think about conventionalism, about modality? Do you think it's like an implausible view, or do you think there's some plausibility to it? And then my second question is, suppose you held that view, what would these debates about the existence of God then look like? Would it turn out that they're just merely verbal issues, or is there still some substance there?
Graham, you want to have a go first?
Well, I'll start with the first thing. I'm not attracted to conventionalism about modality as a view, and I think that the kind of disputes that Tim and I would have about the modal questions take for granted that conventionalism is false as a view about modality. Whether you could even have these disputes if you're a conventionalist about modality, I'm not sure. I'd have to think about that further.
Yeah, I would agree that I don't find that plausible. In fact, I find it difficult really to get a clear sense of what's being claimed. It seems like it's such a sexy claim, so bold, that it really would wash out almost any dispute, because somebody could just start with a different set of metaphysical conventions. I do allow for something that you could call metaphysical possibility, but I would parse that out as logical possibility modulo certain metaphysical claims. However, the status of those claims, and if they're metaphysical truths, then I don't think they're conventional. There are some things that are conventional, but even in languages, once we make some decisions, once we decide what we're going to mean by and not and or, other things are fixed. You don't get the right to say then which things entail which other things once you've made certain even linguistic decisions like that. And that would be the sort of the furthest reach that I would allow convention to go, is that you can conventionally adopt the Sheffer-Stroke function as your primitive or something else, but then what follows is going to be a matter of logical necessity. And if you want to talk metaphysical or physical necessity, then you're going to have to give an argument for why you're holding these metaphysical principles or these physical principles as constant, and then doing your derivation from that. So that's how I would approach it. And the more radical kind of conventionalism is just not something that I'm even sure I fully understand, but to the extent that I do, I would not want to play with it.
Okay, thanks, guys. Do you have any follow-up, Zach, or are you good with that?
I guess I could ask a quick follow-up, which is just to, so both of you seem to think that that a conventionalist view is not true. And I was wondering if you could say more about why you reject that view. Because one argument you could give in favor of it is that you're going to get a simpler view of the world if you're not adding this like primitive ideology of modality to your view of the world. If you can get away with by doing without it, then you're going to have a simpler view. So I guess I'm wondering what do you both think about that kind of argument? I think this is an argument associated with Ted Sider, the thought being that when you're writing the book of the world, you need logical notions, but you don't necessarily need temporal notions. You don't necessarily need modal notions.
I know, Tim, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I guess, I mean, what if I add to my purely conventional list of metaphysical claims that conventionalism is false, and then I move on from there? Can I do that? Am I debarred from doing that? If I'm debarred from doing it, why? Because it seemed like I was allowed to make almost any contingent claims I liked. If that's not a contingent claim, if that's like a necessary falsehood, then I'd like to see the argument that it's a necessary falsehood. So it seems like there might even be some self-referential issues there. Modal metaphysicians are an interesting lot, and sometimes their discussions get really rarefied, and I feel like I'm hiking along the top of Mount Everest and gasping for oxygen as I'm trying to figure out what they're doing. So Graham can speak for himself, but I would rather keep my logic clean. I'm happy with classical bivalent logic in its various extensions and protothetic and second order quantification and other fun things like that. But this kind of conventionalism strikes me as just, if I'm understanding it right, really unpromising and maybe incoherent.
All right. Let's move along. Josh, if you are ready, Josh Williams, you can unmute and ask your question.
Hey, yeah, thank you so much to the experts and the hosts. I'm a MD PhD candidate who's very interested in the resurrection. And I've done some analysis on all of the different injuries that Jesus received. And to the best of my ability, tried to figure out everything that could have gone wrong, everything that could have helped him. And it seemed to me like prior analysis on his on the things that led up to his crucifixion and burial would not have necessarily resulted in death for him. So I'm interested to hear if you have any perspectives on that, and also if you have any recommended reading for me so I can learn more. Thank you.
I'll go first on this one to let Graham organize whatever he wants to. The Romans were professional killers, Roman soldiers. They knew what they were doing. When they set out to kill a man, they made sure he was dead by the time it was over. I just, there was a time in the late 19th century when swoon theories had a little bit of prevalence, and there's even a book called The Fair Haven, in which a sort of maverick minister attempted to say, oh, this will sort of bring everybody together. Yes, Jesus was crucified, but yes, he was alive, but it's because he never really died. And I just don't find that to be a plausible way of trying to put everything together. Strauss, in his Life of Jesus, mercilessly pillories the swoon theory. And one of the reasons he does is not just that the Romans knew how to kill a man, but he says, are we really to believe that a limping, bleeding Jesus inspired the Easter faith of the disciples? This is not a plausible option. And Strauss, of course, has no time whatsoever for the actual resurrection, but sets that one aside summarily. I do have some other resources on that. Josh, do you know how to reach me? Maybe by Facebook. If you don't, I will put my email address in the chat, and anybody is welcome to do this. But Josh, if you will write to me specifically about that, I'll show you what I have. You may already have all of it, but I'm happy to share at such bibliographic things as I can. So I'm going to just drop my email in the chat right now and give Graham a go at this one.
Thank you so much.
Okay, so just picking up on one of the things that Tim said, if you're a naturalist and you're thinking about the what happened, there doesn't seem to be any reason to deny the claim that the Romans put Jesus to death. So, and the evidence that we have of various kinds there doesn't seem to be much at all that would support the swoon theory.
Thank you.
Okay. Graham, do you have any, would you have any resources that would, the best objections to the resurrection that you could recommend? From a philosophical or theological standpoint, from an atheist naturalist worldview?
So I'm not sure what to point to, and Tim may not be surprised by this. So there's a bunch of things that people have said that require really kind of implausible assumptions in order to, once you accept a whole lot of the text of the New Testament, that to kind of make the sequence of events square with the text. My approach is rather different from that, in that I think that there's good reason to reject the supernatural elements of the story, and there's good reasons to be a little bit cautious maybe about some of the non-supernatural parts of the story. But there's not much reason to reject the rest of the story, and largely there's good reasons to accept it. And I think that there's not lots of people who've approached the discussion of, you know, what are you going to say about the overall data here, that have started from that kind of approach. So maybe Tim can correct me, but that's kind of in the broadest outlines what I'm inclined to say.
So a lot of people have attempted to do some kind of quest of the historical Jesus, to try to say, all right, underneath these texts, what is it that this guy really was doing, this Palestinian rabbi? What was he like? How much of what is reported to have been his teaching really is his teaching? How much of it is a certain amount of embellishment or creative reconstruction by his community of followers a generation or two after he lived? Who actually wrote these documents that we call the Gospels? Well, maybe there was a Johannine community who put things together in reverence to the original disciple and adopting his name for their collective writing, something like the Burbakai group. I don't think any of that will stand up to an actual reading of the documents. I think if you read the documents fairly and you read them sensitively, and by this I mean that you read them in the context of what we know about ancient history, about ancient novels. If you actually read Mimesis by Auerbach, and you pay attention to what he says about Odysseus' scar and the description of Fortunata and Petronius and the distinct contrasts that he draws between these things and the biblical narrative, you will see that this is not the kind of story that got told at all in the ancient world. It bears a lot of marks of being written by people close up to the facts. So to that extent, I think Graham might be willing, at least tentatively, to follow along with what I'm doing. But once you do that, then you really have to come to grips with Hume's argument, right? Just how implausible is a miracle claim? And here, my view would be rather like that of Thomas Sherlock, who actually wrote before Hume. You could require more evidence for a miracle claim than for a mundane claim. That's not unreasonable. I get that. I'm with you on that. But you can't put it beyond the reach of evidence altogether. And I think that the evidence we have is sufficient to overcome that reasonable initial presumption. And that's been the position of all the evidential apologists from Sherlock, Douglas, Campbell, Paley, Adams, Whately, and so on down historically. John Leland, Nathaniel Lardner, names that we don't read so much anymore. But that's been the consistent position is, yeah, you can ask for more evidence for a claim like that. That's okay. We're not saying, as G.K. Chesterton once very unwisely said, that if you believe an old apple woman about her apples, then you should believe her about the miracles she claims to have seen. No, that doesn't follow. But then, all right, we're ready. Let's have the discussion. We got the evidence. The Gospels display the same guy, the same Jesus, his dislike of crowds, his sarcasm, his love for his friends. There are characteristics of his teaching, his tendency to use physical objects in the vicinity for the objects of his teaching, that just show that this is testimony really close up to who he was, nearly as close as Boswell was to Johnson. Okay, are there some mistakes? Could be. I don't think that we have to stand on the inerrantist position there, but I don't think that we can dismiss it. And once we take it that seriously, and this is the reason that Bart Ehrman doesn't want to go where Graham is willing at least to consider going, once you take it that seriously, it actually does become kind of hard to disentangle the miracles from the narrative. It's not as easy as all that to demythologize. You can just take your scissors and cut them out wherever you find them. But the only principle that's going to underwrite that is if you say, but just not miracles, whatever else, just not them. And I don't think you can do that a priori. And this is why, it's okay if a little fur was flying in our exchanges in the Zondervan volume. I accused Graham of seeming to want to do some a priori history. That I think we cannot and must not do. And we shouldn't do that with regard to the miracle claims in other religions either. And I'm happy to talk about that. Those of you in Texas know that I had a debate down there a few years ago with Zachary Moore. And that was exactly on the question, could it ever be rational to believe in a reported miracle? And Zach came out with a great grocery list of miracle claims from other religions, but I offered a filter derived from John Douglas's book, The Criterion, one of those contemporaries of Hume who wrote in response to Hume. And so that's where I think if you start going down the road Graham is at least willing to consider going down, then you run into this issue where it becomes progressively harder to do the demythologization. And that's why people like Dale Allison and Bart Ehrman have wanted to hold the text at arm's length and not take as seriously, even as Graham was expressing a willingness to do, the non-miraculous parts of the narrative.
But Tim, I
Thank
mean,
you.
you're going against the great Rudolf Bultmann of the demythologizers. I mean, these are the great theologians of the 20th century. By the way, let me do a quick story. I think it was Josephus, wasn't it, Tim, that had a couple friends that were crucified, and he went to Vespasian and said, oh my gosh, he crucified the wrong people. So they actually took them down from the cross. Am I right on that?
Yeah, they had just been nailed up, and he immediately sent word and got permission to take them down. Two of them died anyway. With the best medical help, one of them survived.
Right.
They did not go through to the end of the crucifixion. They got pulled down before the Romans came along, broke their legs, shoved spears in their sides, or whatever else they were going to do.
But could you imagine being crucified and live again? And just,
this,
you know,
it was. This is not on my bucket list. Not trying.
But anyway, you know what? Back to the great Rudolf Bultmann and the demythology. You can't go against. I mean, wasn't this settled 100 years ago?
I admire the learning of some of the great biblical scholars. I am not equally persuaded that their judgment is to be admired.
Thank you, guys. We have more questions, James. Nathan Ferguson, if you can hear me, you can unmute and fire away, Nathan.
Thank you so much. Appreciate
Yes.
it. Wow, I'm just so grateful to be here, and thank you so much. This is the first time I've been to an event like this. I guess my question's for both of you. Maybe start with Tim. Is it McGrew? Is it Professor? Okay, wonderful. Would love to hear your perspective. So my question's maybe a little basic, though I just want to learn some basic definitions for words. I'm wondering, can each of you define for me the difference between belief, knowledge, and ignorance? And if these things, can these words be used to describe our understanding for both things we accept as true as equally as they can for things that we accept are false?
So I'm not sure exactly what you're aiming for. Belief is a propositional attitude so it's a stance that one takes, a mental stance that one takes towards something that can be expressed as a proposition, though it needn't always be thus expressed. Also, it needn't be always explicit. I can believe things tacitly. Like I believe that there are more than 4 people watching this exchange right now, although I hadn't really formulated that, and I think I could have been said to have believed it all along, even before I popped out with it here. Belief, knowledge, I am happy with a little modification of a classic definition of knowledge. I think knowledge is true belief justified by known premises. That's not circular, but it is a recursive definition. And so to get it started, you need there to be some starter set of things that you know. I'm a classical, or at least neoclassical foundationalist. So I do think that there are some things that we know that can be primitives to start that off. Once you take that definition in a recursive way, that cuts off get your problems. So the internalist toolkit is adequate to address those. Ignorance is a state of mind in which one does not know a certain thing, or perhaps whether a certain thing is the case. Ignorance is not incompatible with belief. We can believe things that we are ignorant of and not realize it, and that's a really bad place to be. But some of us are there, and no doubt almost all of us are in that position with regard to some things. Right? The problem is not that we that we're wrong. It's that we don't know where we're wrong. So we have to muddle through and try to find a way to identify those things. I think one of the best ways to identify places where you may be wrong and not realize it, or you may be ignorant but believing, is to have discussions like Graham and I and the rest of us have been having. Right? Find the people who are thoughtful, who aren't just going to be your typical trolls or something and throw epithets at you, but who actually are trying to engage with the same set of issues, who at least share a broad range of the same data, but who disagree vigorously with your position and try to figure out why. Because if we are wrong, then there is no better way that I know for us to find out where we're wrong than by trying to engage with the best people who disagree with us. That seems to just be methodologically the way to go. And that's why I absolutely love the Atheist Christian Book Club, because I think you guys are doing it right. You disagree, you know that you disagree, you trade off selecting books. When I was down there, you were all meeting physically and we had a meal. I am hoping that that might be a possibility when I'm down next, because I don't know whether it was the atheists or the Christians cooking that time, but you guys do a good job. So Graham, I mean, this is an argument for getting to Texas sometime, all on its own.
Yeah.
Just trust me on this one, just take my word for it.
Tim, we'll have a dinner. We'll have a Tim McGrew dinner. We'll just get together and do this. We're kind of over COVID, so you can come on down and we'll make you grub.
The last time I think the atheists were hoping to have me for dinner in a different sense. So but that went well and I enjoyed it all the same. So yeah, now I'm sorry, Nathan, I answered some of your questions, but I think I may have lost the final one. Do you want to just re-articulate that and then I'll give Graham a go at it?
Yeah, I can repeat it. Can each of you define for me the difference between belief, knowledge, and ignorance? And if these words can be used to describe our understanding for both things we accept as true, as equally as we can for things that we accept as false.
Yeah, I think we can believe things that are true. We can believe things that are false. I'm good old-fashioned correspondence theorist in terms of the definitions of true and false. To say of what is that it is, or of what is not that it is not, is to speak the truth. So yeah, we can believe things and accept them and be wrong. We can believe things and accept them and be right. We can know things that are true. We cannot know things that are false. So that's the one limitation that I would put on that. And that's really all that I've got that can be fit onto the back of an envelope. And if you want more, then we should correspond. I have now put my email address into the chat. So if you want to grab that.
And one last follow-up question, if I may.
Well, okay.
I'm sorry. And what's the difference between belief and knowledge?
Belief is the propositional attitude that we have when it's fully conscious and not just tacit, is morphs into express assent to something, that you characterize the world as being a certain way in accordance with the proposition believed. Knowledge is true belief that is justified by, in the inferential case, premises that are known. So if you got a starter set of things that you know, and then those justify other things, and you're right about those other things, then you have knowledge. So it's just a variant on the true justified belief definition, but the recursive case stops getting your problems. Graham, over to you.
Okay, so I don't really have very much to add to what Tim said. I do think that in general, it's often hard to give definitions of philosophical terms, but you can point to examples. And so, I mean, you kind of know what belief and ignorance and knowledge are by examples because you're familiar with them. So I'm kind of quite happy with what Tim said about belief. I'd be more cautious about what he said about knowledge. I'm not sure that anybody's got a very good definition of knowledge, but I'm not sure that that matters very much. One other thing that I would say is that there are some people these days who think that kind of, if we're thinking about the kind of relative fundamentality of these notions, that the most basic thing is knowledge, and that's a more fundamental state from a theoretical point of view than belief. Whereas when you're thinking, if you're thinking of defining knowledge in terms of justified true belief, that's kind of might tempt you to think that belief is the more fundamental.
Right. I would definitely.
Anyway, all of that would head us off into the weeds to pursue that.
Yeah, my view is pretty much the philosophic negative, the photographic negative of Timothy Williamson's view. Justification first, let knowledge fall where it may.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Nathan, for your question. Brian, if you're still here, unmute and ask your question. Fire away.
Okay, thank you. So I spoke with my friend yesterday, and he's a lot more philosophically informed than I am, and we were talking about Dr. Oppy and his views. And so my question is, I'm really just trying to get clarity on what Dr. Oppy's view is, but my friend raised a complaint that was basically like, Dr. Oppy prefers to view theistic arguments through a naturalistic framework, and he's under the impression that you discount arguments in favor of frameworks. But the problem with that would be frameworks are only as good as the arguments in favor of them. So I was wondering if you could address that. Like, do you agree that, for example, like the Kalam argument might be good, but we should, for some reason, prefer to view it through a naturalistic framework, or what's your position on that?
So, I mean, depends. The Kalam syllogism ends up with the conclusion that there's a cause of the existence of the universe, which I will understand to keep things simple as meaning there's a cause of the existence of natural reality. And no naturalist is going to accept that, I don't think. So, just on that particular point, I don't think that that the viewing the argument through a naturalistic lens and enables you to embrace it. On the kind of more substantive kind of, there's a bigger question in the background. I'm thinking that theory is in an important sense prior to argument, that when it comes to the assessment of arguments, what you rely on is the prior theory that you already accept. Your judgments about which claims are true just determine your judgments about which amongst the valid arguments are the sound ones. And it doesn't go in the other direction. It's not like in order to accept a theory, you amass a whole lot of arguments and then somehow or other you extract from the arguments what's the theory to accept. So I do think that in a quite important sense, arguments are not that interesting. What matters is the theory and the evidence that you've got for it. Now, that's not to say that arguments have no role to play when you're having, when you're trying to sort of come up against someone who disagrees with you. So you've got a theoretical disagreement. And one thing that might turn out is that one or other of you has got an inconsistent theory, and an argument, a logical derivation could be very handy in showing one of you that your position's inconsistent and that you've got some work to do to revise. But in general, I think that the weight of the discussion is not about trading in arguments. It's about pointing to bits of evidence and saying, how do you account for that? Anyway, that's probably.
Let me ask you guys a question, back to reality. One of the problems we have as atheists in the book club, and a lot of people have maybe had their faith shaken because of this argument. And I think you guys both can get to 10 to the minus 43rd. You both believe in the Big Bang, correct?
Yeah, I'm happy with.
Are you happy, Grant?
I mean, it could be revised later, but I think that's the way to go at present.
So the point is, they saw the red shifts, the universe is obviously expanding. And if you wind it back, you get to the singularity, and it expands at an enormous rate. So one of the things that is a problem for atheists is that you have to have this precisely fine-tuned, because you have all this mass of galaxies and dust and galactic dust stuff that has to be so fine-tuned, because if it goes too fast, then you're not going to get any planets or galaxies or anything. If it goes too slow, all that mass, because of gravity, is going to contract, and you're just going to get a big black hole. And here's the thing, you only have one chance to do this right, one chance to make the periodic table. So my question is mainly to you, Graham, is, and even Stephen Hawking has said, the chance is like that all this would be precisely fine-tuned and the expansion would be so precise that it's like 1 in a million. So my question to you, Graham, is how do you answer this fine-tuning argument? Help me with my faith here.
Sorry, I'm just looking through to see if Luke's still here.
I
left.
wish he was here.
He left.
could've-
He had to take off.
He left
And Dan knows
because I
about
could
that. Go
because
ahead.
I could handball this question to him and he'd have a better answer. So, and maybe some of the things that I'll say will go wrong, but the first thing will be, okay, so we have apparently the way that physics stands at the moment, a bunch of quantities that we write into our theories by hand, and those quantities can't vary even a tiny amount without, according to our current theories, the universe being vastly different. Either sort of lasts for a tiny fraction of a second, it just immediately collapses in on itself, or it blows apart and forever it's basically just empty space with an occasional particle. So that's the kind of the most dramatic way of presenting the fine tuning, right? So if you thought that the initial conditions of the universe were just selected by lot from amongst a vast range of possibilities, there's almost no chance that you're going to get a universe in which there's stars or snails or pick anything, right? Anything that you might care about. Okay, so one question is whether the fine tuning is just an artifact of ignorance, right? This is the current state of physical theorizing, but ultimately we'll have a theory in which we don't have to put in any values by hand, where the fine tuning disappears, right? Who knows? I'd like to ask Luke his view about that issue. So put that to one side. Suppose that the fine tuning is real in the following sense, that it's true that on our physical modeling, we make models of the universe, and then we adjust the parameters of the models of the universe. We get vastly different predictions about what the universe is going to be like. What might we say in response to this? One question that I want to know the answer to, so again, I want to ask Luke this question, is, so where in the history of the universe are the values of the constants fixed? Have they been fixed since the beginning? Or was there some subsequent point where there was some transition in the universe and the values got filled at that point? I think that if the second story is true, then what you say is, well, that's just how the chances played out. It doesn't matter how unlikely they are, extraordinarily unlikely things happen. If we really have evidence that there was this transition, that values weren't fixed to they were fixed, then that's going to be the best story that you can tell. On the other hand, if the values are fixed from the beginning, so they've always been the way they are, then you can see where my theory about modality is going to turn out to be very useful at this point. There's no other way they could have been. And so you just have an answer. Okay, so there we go.
Tim's smiling.
Yeah, I think that that answer has all the advantages of theft over honest toil, to steal Bertrand Russell's line. It's like, yeah, that would be really, really inconvenient for my theory unless I just said, you know what, I don't need to consider that to be something that requires an explanation. I'm just going to say it's all baked in right there at the outset. And this is a consistent thing for Graham to do, right? I mean, I get the consistency. I admire that about him. He's trying to put together a picture that that works. But I think that theory of modality is a price that he's paying. That I'm waiting with my IOU in hand, Graham. I want that bit back now.
Yeah. So I'm going to ask you, so what's the cost, right? It seems to me that it's a great theory of modality. And I don't see what it doesn't deliver in terms of ordinary modal reasoning. So
the range of
I don't see the costs there. Bearing in mind that I am going to say that there's lots of stuff that's not metaphysically possible, but you can reasonably believe it, right? So there's that sense. There are kind of epistemic or doxastic possibilities, and you can use those to do the work that other people want to squeeze all into perhaps into metaphysical modality.
Right. So that's exactly where I'm going, is I'm going to say our credences are distributed across a vast sigma algebra. And even if they're not point credences, even if they're interval valued or vague, there are all kinds of different ways of modeling that, and you're familiar with that literature. Still, they're distributed over a sigma algebra that includes state descriptions of the universe that don't share any causal parts with the early universe that is the actual one. And so when you say, oh, it's necessary and therefore there's nothing that needs to be said about it, it's that last clause that I'm just not buying. No, it may be necessary in the sense in which you've just defined necessary, but that's not a sense that will do the work of absolving you from giving some kind of reasons here at just that point. Merely saying, well, it's necessary in a certain sense of necessary doesn't, on your account that you're at least, inclined to for this, do that work. And that's the point at which talking becomes interesting.
Right. So I guess I don't see that. But anyway,
would it be
that is, I don't see that there's anything illegitimate about the move, and I don't see that there's anything that's wrong with the kind of explanation that's being offered of the data.
Can I just make one side comment back toward the question that someone initially raised that got us off on this? Graham said in response that he finds theories to be sort of the more interesting pieces, and not arguments per se, but rather theory and evidence and the fit between them. And the question was a question about whether one assesses these things from one's worldview or one's very, very broad theory. And I think in general, Graham does evaluate the evidence in a way that is not needlessly colored by his theory. But there was one point in the book, The Best Argument Against God, and this is on pages 71, 72, where he's considering the problem of evil, where I think maybe inadvertently he did slip and shoehorn something in that is a consequence of his theory that is, I don't think you're allowed to do at that move in the argument. This had to do with the question of the death of infants and the question of whether they're, starving to death or being tortured and murdered is something that can conduce to their good. And Graham says, well, no, there's just this obvious reason that it can't, and it's that they don't exist anymore. That's true on the naturalist picture, but it's not true on the Christian picture. And so it can't be used as a sort of topic neutral, content neutral assertion in an argument against someone who's going to take not merely bare theism, but the specific Christian view of the matter. So the texture of that becomes somewhat more complex. I'm not saying there are no issues to be dealt with there, but that seemed to me to be just a little bit too quick with regard to at least one very broad and widely accepted form of theism.
So it depends what was going on there. So, because you're right, I may well have made a mistake by my own lights. If the question was whether naturalists are perfectly fine with making this judgment, then I seem to be in the right. If my claim was theists can't make a dissenting judgment, then I'd be wrong. I'd have to go back and look at the context.
Yeah, what you say there, I've got it in front of me, is that if the horrendous suffering of an individual is to be justified, then surely it must be justified in terms of benefits to the individual who undergoes the horrific suffering in question. If the horrendous suffering, so you're considering theodicies at this point. If the horrendous suffering of a young baby that is raped and killed is justified, then it is justified in terms of benefits that accrue to the baby in question. But if this is right, then there is a straightforward argument that there are no goods that we cannot know about that accrue to the baby. After all, the existence of the baby is brought to an end by the very horrendous suffering whose justification is in question.
Right. So that's right. It depends. I'm trying to think about what the broader context here is. If it's because remember the overall structure is all I'm thinking about is there's a bunch of different sort of sets of evidence, and I'm thinking about whether there's some explanatory advantage that accrues to theism or to naturalism with respect to the evidence. And the overall point of the discussion here is to argue that naturalism is not doing any worse than theism when it comes to the explanation of the evils that we find in the world. Maybe some people have thought there might be some advantage that accrues to naturalism, but that's not even what I'm trying to argue. So it may well be, and again, I don't have the book in front of me. You may well be right that I've said something that I shouldn't have said at that point. I mean, thinking about the overall purpose of the discussion at that point, it will be quite unnecessary for me to have done that.
Okay.
Thank you both.
Let's do this real quick, if I could. I just had a curious question here. Logos channel made a note. Graham was talking about what would Luke Barnes say at this point, question about cosmology, and he just put a comment in here. Luke would just ask little question 2.0 in response. So I don't know if, I don't want to put him on the spot, but if Logos channel could let us know what is little question 2.0 that Luke would probably say at this point. Are you still with us? They may have dropped out.
Yeah, if you can unmute. Okay, they're trying to unmute.
Oh,
Just hit
okay,
your
sorry,
space bar.
There we go. Can everybody hear me?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Hi, how's it going? Little
Excellent.
question 2.0 basically is, okay, so there's a couple of ways that Barnes tackled the question. He did a recent debate with James Fodor on the channel Digital Gnosis, where this exact thing was brought up. And how Luke responded to it was by saying that, look, there's three layers to this. There's the physics we know, the physics we could know, and there's the question of determinism. So under the physics we do know right now, he calls this little question 1.0, what's the probability of seeing the constants we see? It's really small, blah, blah, blah. But suppose we find some unifying theory of physics like Graham was talking about, where the constants kind of wash out and there's some like reason why it just is the case that the constants are tuned the way they're tuned. Well, the question 2.0 is, why do we have a universe in which that theory of physics is the theory of physics that washes out such that we have this life permitting thing? And of all the possible ways the universes could have been with their laws of physics and so on and so on and so forth. And so what Luke would say is, like, even if the laws of physics deem this probable in some sense, that would be evidence for theism, because of all the ways the universe could have been, we just happen to be the one that makes the constants the way they are. And then if we shift this to modality, where like there's some necessary reasons, at least like metaphysically necessary, like there's no bottom from the necessary facts, say in Oppy's view, that would entail these physical facts that make things the way they are. Luke might say, well, okay, but consider parallel necessities, right? So suppose you've got two possible universes, each with their own metaphysically necessary like initial points, and each of them branch off differently. And one universe branches off by chance or whatever with life permitting constants and so on. But this other possible world, so to speak, branches off in which it's not life permitting. And then Luke would say, well, imagine all the possible initial states that could have been or something, each of which individually metaphysically necessary in its own context, that could branch off. And by Luke's lights, it seems that a life permitting universe at the end of one of those causal history trees would be an unlikely outcome relative to all the other ones, as I think the gist of his little question 2.0.
And one thing is that when you said possible, so to speak, by the lights of the theory, you're talking about things that are impossible. And whether you want to think that there are impossible worlds is a kind of subject of debate, as lots of things are in contemporary philosophy. I'm one of the people who don't like impossible worlds at all. I don't know what Tim's view about them is.
No, I agree. But I think that the question, though, is among metaphysically very different possible worlds in the Leibnizian sense of possibility. You know, you can take two very different starting points that don't share that overlapping bit of the actual world, and you can run them out in various ways. And that's the sort of framework. And I was waiting for you to ride in on the horse of your favorite view of modality and try to save the day again with that one there, but maybe I'm misunderstanding the question.
So I will reinterpret what you just said in terms of doxastic possibilities. You know, someone could reasonably think that the universe goes that way. You know, you can, or maybe we can make it further. You can imagine that the universe could have gone that way, but that's got nothing to do with metaphysics, right? The nature of reality isn't beholden to our imaginations. So that's the kind of thing that I'm going to say in response to that kind of point.
Okay, thank you. James, you want to do a couple more questions, or you want to kind of wrap it up? We are getting toward 9 o'clock.
Yeah, if we could get a couple in. I just know that Jonas has talked about back on the subject of resurrection, and maybe about 20 minutes ago had mentioned a JAMA article suggesting Gary Habermas is something to follow up on that. Boy, there's just so much good stuff here. I know we're about out of time. Maybe if you could just pick out one more question, and then I'll wrap up.
All right.
Pick someone.
All right. So Bill, Vincent, if Bill's still here, Bill, you've been waiting patiently. If you are still here, you can unmute and ask your question.
Yep, I'm still here.
There you go. I didn't see you. I'm on my iPad. I can't see half of everybody. So go for it.
That's right. So, Graham, I had a question for you about the problem of evil. So on page 154, you say, since we can be sure that we haven't yet examined all logical arguments from evil, any generalizations that we make about the failure of logical arguments from evil should involve some measure of caution. And I think I would be inclined to agree with that if, so like the three kinds of premises that you mentioned above that is a sufficient condition. And, you know, like also having like the conclusion God doesn't exist. If those things are a sufficient condition for having a logical problem of evil, I think that's probably right. But I guess I usually think of the logical problem of evil as maybe saying a little bit more than that. So it's maybe trying to aim at some sort of internal inconsistency in the theistic views. I feel like this might be like a reason, for example, why Mackey like called the kind of like connections like quasi-logical laws. Maybe this was the analytic, something along those lines. And I think taken in that way, then I would be inclined to think something like the free will defense we're just supposed to show that, in fact, you can make an argument from maybe certain kinds of internal commitments of Christianity or theism to the actual consistency of evil. I would think that's just kind of a clincher when it comes to logical arguments from evil. So I was just curious whether you agree with that characterization of logical arguments from evil and whether you agree with that upshot.
So I have a paper on logical arguments from evil where I argue that the kind of planting as free will defense is not sufficient to knock down logical arguments from evil, but that's because I think of the logical arguments from evil as being a family where you have a bunch of premises about divine attributes, you have a claim about evil, and then you have some bridging claims that connect these things, the various attributes in evil together. And you can show that the set of claims are jointly inconsistent. Right. Now, that's not the way that Mackey characterized his own argument in the 1955 paper, but according to me, it's the way he should have done it. He should, because there is actually just a straightforward logical inconsistency between the various claims that he puts down. And what he should have been saying is all of those claims are claims that are accepted by theists or some theists or whatever. And were he right about that, that would have been interesting. It would have meant that theists would have to revise their views about something. Of course, the way that people responded to Mackey, by and large, was to say, but look, those two bridging claims that a good thing eliminates evil as far as it can, and there are no limits to what an omnipotent being can do, we don't accept that, right? Those claims are both false, and it's not very hard to see how, from a theistic perspective, you're going to think they're false. We can move on to more complicated arguments. So the only attributes that figure in Mackey's argument are omnipotence and goodness. In Rowe's argument, we also have omniscience featuring as well. We have a similar kind of argument, but it's got a premise. I'm talking about his logical argument because his argument originally is a logical argument. We have the same sort of problem. In fact, both of the premises are controversial, though the number of people who follow Bob Adams in sort of rejecting the theological premise are fairly small, but the empirical premise is just there's lots of people got reasons for rejecting that. But there might be, if you bring in more premises, and in particular, I'm thinking, for example, that you might bring in, apart from omnipotence, omniscience, and perfect goodness, things like being the sole creator of all else, or at least all else that's got a creator. That gives you more scope to produce an argument where maybe the premises are going to be harder for a theist to reject. And in principle, there's kind of no limit. I mean, to be an argument from evil, it's just got to have some claim about evil as a key premise, and then a bunch of claims about God and some stuff that links it all together. I don't see how you can kind of rule that out. And I don't think that anything like the approach that Plantinga takes in those two 1974 books is anything like a demonstration that that can't be done. Right. So that's basically the view.
Can I throw a couple things in? Yeah. So, I mean, in principle, Graham is right, but we can say the same thing about almost any position, right?
Yeah, sure.
There's no a priori way to say that atheism is internally consistent, because after all, it might be that on a certain conception, if we were to go deeply enough into it, we could come up with that. So that since that cuts all directions, it's kind of subject to the Gilbert and Sullivan principle, right? If everybody's somebody, no one's anybody. So if you're going to do it that way, then I don't think that's per se something that should stop us from saying, well, this version of this argument doesn't do what it's supposed to do. The distinction that Plantinga makes between a defense and a theodicy is the place where I would go if I were inclined to criticize Christianity. I would say, look, forget trying to do this deductively. Go the Bayesian route when Rowe finally got around to doing his evidential argument in a Bayesian fashion, and try that. Now, Rowe consistently refers not just to the fact of evils, but to the magnitude of them, how many there are. And here I think it's important to remember one limitative point. Let's grant, for the sake of argument, whether you would concede this or not, that the existence of a particularly heinous murder and rape is prima facie evidence against the existence of a benevolent omni-God, right? So let's just grant that this is some evidence against that. Now, if it's the case, nevertheless, that God has a morally adequate reason for having permitted that, whatever that reason may be, and it may be something beyond our ken, then that shifts the odds for the next thing you bring up, at least for a certain range of things. Right? If God's got a reason to allow one child to die of bone cancer, then he may well have an equally good reason to allow a different child to die of bone cancer. And so the cumulative impact of listing a whole bunch of these evils doesn't have quite the value that it would have on independence. Once we go probabilistic, these things become more complicated. And so I think many people have thought that the problem of evil in its evidential form is a knockdown because they're impressed, as who could not be impressed, by the wide scope of all the ills in the world. But it doesn't really have quite that effect if you think about it contextually like that. And so that's just one respect in which the argument becomes more difficult. My saying that isn't going to erase the argument. That's like the beginning of a discussion and not the end of it. But here we are at 9 o'clock Texas time.
That's true.
And that said, I want to say thank you for both of those comments. Just a reminder before we wrap up that our next book club is going to be June 3rd, and we're going to be looking at Richard Dawkins' book, The Outgrowing God. So mark that on your calendars to be ready for that. I want to thank Tim. I want to thank Graham. Man, you guys have been excellent. Thanks so much for being part of the book club. I hope we can come back and do some of your other works later. Tim, we've already got you down for later this year. In closing, I do want to circle back, kind of wrap up with my colleague Bill Cluck. Bill, at the beginning we were talking about the resurrection, and he wanted a percentage, he wanted a number. What is the odds that Jesus rose from the dead? And so, Bill, if you're still there, if you could unmute and tell me, could you give me your number? What would you put the odds of Jesus rose from the dead, since you're an atheist? 1,000 to 1. What would you say the odds are?
Can you hear me?
Still with us? Oh, there you go. Yeah, I can hear you now.
No, I would say 15% to 10 to 15%, because there are good reasons and good evidences for Christianity. It was birthed in Jerusalem, where it could have easily been falsified. There's no good reason that this faith should have continued when your leader, your hero, your mentor dies ignominious death. There's just no reason why that, and even the skeptical people, scholars, believe that they suddenly and sincerely came to believe that Jesus rose from the dead. So there's some good evidences that I'm willing to look at, and and I hope we can read Resurrecting Jesus, because that is the balanced approach by a real scholar who taught at Pittsburgh and the great place on the East Coast. I forgot.
No more fake scholars, right?
No, we're talking real scholars here. And
hey,
by the way,
so you and I've talked about this so many times, and I just so I appreciate you giving me that number. I know it's hard to really quantify something like that, but let me just make an observation. Yeah,
please pray for Richard Dawkins to appear. That could really strengthen.
If Richard Dawkins appeared at our book club, then you would know that there's a much greater probability it's a God, right?
That it's up to 50% after that.
But just a quick just an insight on that, or observation on that. If I had a 10 to 15% chance of winning the lottery, I would play every week. I don't play the lottery because I don't have those kind of odds. But I think you're closer to the kingdom than you think you are, Bill.
Oh wow! Thanks, Jesus. What would your percentage be, James?
I can't quantify it. It's just almost impossible. I will say that I have doubts. We've talked about that. I think the only way that the only people who don't ever have doubts are people who don't think. And so,
well, wait a minute. We've asked me. We've asked you. We've asked Tim. Graham, what's your percentage?
So pretty low. I don't have a number, as you would expect.
It's hard to quantify, isn't it?
Yes. Graham, I have one simple, probably the simplest question of the evening, I guess. Maybe it's too simple, and I'm embarrassed that maybe it's too simple. What is your particular view, belief, about Jesus?
So we sort of started to talk about
yeah, we did.
So there are people out there who think that it's all a myth, right? I'm not one of them, right? So I think that there's obviously a kind of historical core in the account that we get in the Gospels and in Acts. I just think that the kind of supernatural stuff that's in there is false, right? So but I'm quite happy with the idea, and maybe I'm just repeating myself now, that there was a teacher who had a ministry for a while, and he kind of got sold to the Romans by the Jewish council, and he ended up being crucified by the Romans. And then his followers eventually were the kind of the beginnings of the various Christian churches that we see now. Right, so there's a kind of very brief summary.
No, that's good. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Again, thank you everybody for being part of the Atheist and Christian Book Club. One thing I really enjoy about this is we don't, neither side shy away from asking tough questions. I think we had both sides ask some very good, tough questions, but it is friendly, and this week especially, this month especially, a scholarly discussion, and I think it benefits all sides. So thank you, and until next month, have a great month, and we will see you.
James?
Yes.
James, just one thing, because a few people have asked, and I just want to verbally clarify. This video will be up within a week or so on the Atheist Christian Book Club YouTube channel. You can check there. You can also check at atheistchristianbookclub.com in the next week or so. I'm the one that edits it, and I will get this up and turn it out as soon as I can.
Yeah, he does a great job on that, and we have, probably close to 2 years of book clubs on there that you can look back over the previous gatherings. Thanks so much, and we will see you next month.
Thank you, guys. And Graham, thanks for this. This is a lot of fun.
Thank you very much. See you, Tim. See you.